Recording on the cloud. Awesome. Greg, I'm going to turn you around so you can see everyone. Is that cool?
Oh, that sounds delightful.
Awesome. Say hi.
Oh, hey guys.
So that's who you're talking to tonight.
Sweet.
I just spent a few minutes bragging on you, so I won't do it again because I feel like that'd be weird for them. But we're super here, Greg. I told them that you were quoting Shakespeare to us during this.
Oh gosh, so folks, whatever expectations you have, if they're like up here, I need you to take them and just bring them way down for me.
All right, we're gonna bring them below Shakespeare, but expectations are still really high. And then he started reciting all he could remember from the number of pi, which is 3.14, and then blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, you got like probably 20 digits in there. It was really impressive.
And then I got lost. So, I don't remember that much
what?
from high school.
You probably could have kept going. No, you definitely could have kept going, and I wouldn't have known the difference. So awesome. Well, guys, I'm really excited for you to hear Greg's story. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. And the number that you texted for the contact tracing tonight, that number will also be used for anonymous Q&A. So as we go through the Q&A, the interview here, and you start having questions that you want to ask, go ahead and ask them, and they're going to show up for me on my email, and I'll start reading them for Greg after we've kind of done our interview. So yeah, well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. Could you just tell us a little bit about your story and specifically your story in regards to your journey of faith and sexuality?
Yeah, and I'll say just as kind of a preliminary comment, anytime I do talking about my own story, I like to preface it by quoting from one of my favorite authors, who's the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who, by the way, if you haven't read any Adichie, just do yourself and the world a favor and read some Adichie because she's wonderful. But she gives this TED Talk about the single story. And here's what she says about the single story. She says, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete because they take one story and make it the only story. So I just want to acknowledge up front that my hope in telling you my story this evening is not that this would be the only story that you hear, or that you would take this and think, yes, I can just kind of paste this onto every other person I meet who loves Jesus and is seeking to follow him and is anything other than 100% card carrying straight. My hope is instead that my story would maybe spark a bit of thinking in your own minds about what following Jesus can look like for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Oh my gosh, yeah. We want to give you full permission to not feel like you have to represent everyone who's been in a similar experience as you. This is your story, and this is one of many. I appreciate you prefacing that before we start. That's a really good point. Yeah,
thanks,
that's
Lane.
Awesome.
So having given that caveat, let's start the story in puberty, which is a terrible time to start any story. Here's my memory of puberty. I grew up in the church, which means that I grew up going to youth group. And in youth group, they would do this thing where they split the boys and the girls apart. And I remember at this stage of my life, all the girls were like freakishly tall and wore a lot of eyeshadow. And so they'd take all the eyeshadow wearing girls and they'd send them off to one room. And then they'd get the boys together and they'd be like, look, boys, we know what you're all going through. You want to look at pictures of naked women, but don't do it. And I was like, okay, no looking at pictures of naked women. And I discovered that I was like remarkably good at not looking at pictures of naked women. In fact, I was so good at it that I started to feel like I was like the holiest 12-year-old in the world, because I was like, there's this thing that they're telling me all the boys are going through and I'm not going through it. I think I've been spared because I just love Jesus so much. So here I am, kind of throwing out my elbow, patting myself on the back. And it took me a little while, maybe just because I'm slow about these things, but it took me a little while to realize that I did in fact have an experience of sexuality. It just wasn't the one that I had been trained and braced by the Christians around me to expect. And so suddenly I went from feeling like the holiest 12-year-old in the world to feeling like the worst possible 12-year-old in the world, the one who was so awful that nobody had even bothered to warn me that I might exist. And so I began to wrestle with the narratives that I felt like I had available to me at that time to try to explain that experience, what I was supposed to do if I was gay or if I seemed to be gay, and yet I wanted to be somebody who followed Jesus. And there were sort of two narratives that I was at least somewhat familiar with at the time. There was the ex-gay narrative, which said if you love Jesus sufficiently, then you pray, you figure out what's gone wrong, and you become straight. And then there was the gay affirming narrative that said, no, you just need to revisit the biblical texts, look at them contextually, and you'll conclude they don't actually say that you can't be in a loving, monogamous, same-sex relationship, and you can just enter into that kind of relationship. So looking at those two narratives, the one that was more familiar to me by far, the one that was more prevalent in the Christian communities that I was in growing up, was this ex-gay narrative. And so that was the narrative that I tried to sort of live into, to pray into. I tried to figure out what had gone wrong. I read a lot of books that told me things like, it's probably because you had a distant father and an overbearing mother. And I looked at my parents and I was like, my parents are kind of awesome, so I don't know if we can blame them, but it's probably just my fault. But I was like, praying I can do. So I did lots of praying and lots of waiting for the right girl to come along so that I could become straight and become what I thought I was supposed to be in order to follow Jesus. And so that was the narrative that I hoped and prayed and tried to live into through middle school and high school and college. And when at the tail end of college, it had become increasingly clear that was not the direction that I was moving, that I did indeed seem to be growing in my faith and falling more deeply in love with Jesus, but it wasn't making me any straighter. And my brief attempts at dating a woman were pretty pathetic, and mostly only accomplished breaking both of our hearts. And so I began to wrestle with this question of, if God keeps saying no to that, then what am I supposed to do instead? What do I get to say yes to? And so I really started to wrestle more with that second narrative, with the gay affirming narrative. And at this moment in our conversation, I won't go into great depth about my investigation of the biblical text, though we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But I really took some time to go back to the Bible and say, I need to see again whether this thing says what I've been told that it says. So I spent some time wrestling with the Bible, and I reached a couple conclusions. One of them was that I discovered to my surprise that there was no biblical promise that I would be straight, which was kind of shocking to me. Like, I was so ready for it to be in there somewhere. I was looking for that passage that said something like, then shalt thou experience only the desire for the opposite sex and never the same sex, somewhere in like the book of Second Hesitations. I was so ready for it to be in there, but yeah, right. But it wasn't there. Like, there was no biblical promise that I would be straight, and there was no biblical promise that I would get married, and there was no biblical promise that I would ever have sex. I also found that this question of sexual ethics, I found that it was a little bit more complicated than I had been led to believe. That it was more complicated than people told me when they said, just flip open your Bible in the English translation, find the word homosexual in there somewhere. It's bad. Case closed, moving on to something more pressing like the Calvinist-Arminian debate. I found that conversation, actually, yeah, right. I found that conversation was complicated, but despite the complexity, I did end up concluding that there was still a best answer in the text, and that was an answer that called somebody who was in my shoes, who didn't really have a desire to be in an opposite sex marriage, that I was called to celibacy. And that has brought me to the place that I'm in now, which is I'm celibate. I plan to stay that way unless the Lord throws me a wild curveball between now and the hereafter. And that has brought a wide variety of delights and challenges and joys and sorrows with it. But here we are.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that part of your story. I feel like you said, there's the ex-gay narrative over here, and then there's the the affirming narrative over here, and you've somehow placed yourself in neither of those for your life and kind of in the middle, I would imagine that like for either community, you get a lot of like pushback, I would imagine, from those who have chosen to be affirming, for those who have chosen that if you're not ex-gay, then there's no room for you. I feel like you've probably taken a lot of heat from either side. Can you speak a little bit to what that's been like for you?
It can be wonderfully awkward here in the middle. Um, it's funny. I'm the sort of person who for those of you who Enneagram, are you guys into the Enneagram? Is that a thing you do in
I think it's
Oregon?
probably hit or miss with a lot of us, but there are a lot of us out there. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I would self-identify as a 9 on the Enneagram, which means that I like making everybody happy. And I used to be really, really good at making everybody happy. Like it was a gift of mine. I knew how to like frame everything just right so that everyone would simultaneously like me. And I remember that I used to read the words of Jesus in the Gospels where he says, woe to you when all people speak well of you. I would read that and be like, I'm a little worried because it seems like a lot of people are speaking well of me. Then I came out as like gay and celibate, and all of a sudden I was like, I am not worried about that anymore. Like my reputation is shot. Uh, and which has been remarkably good at, I think, breaking down some of the natural idolatry that I have in my heart toward my own good Christian reputation, toward the idea that people ought to think well of me. But it's really been a gift, I think, to discover that even though you can catch a lot of flack on either side from the people who really want you to stop being gay and the people who really want you to stop being celibate, there's also this wonderful and beautiful group of people that you encounter somewhere in the middle. And you feel a little bit homeless, but then you find each other and you're like, oh, wow, we're all kind of homeless together. And the feeling of homelessness doesn't completely go away. And yet the company is just so darn good in the middle. It's my sincere conviction that the best company is always to be found among the people who are pursuing Jesus most fervently, often between camps that would call us away in one direction or another.
Greg, my goodness, that speaks to my soul in so many ways. I feel like there's a lot all of us could learn from understanding identifying with Jesus in that space that can give us a lot of peace and joy in our lives, honestly. I know that me personally stepping into this conversation, a lot of stuff behind the scenes to lift the veil a little bit. I've been getting heat from both sides of the conversation as well. And I was wrestling with my friend. I was like, man, it's like hard to make everyone happy. And he told me, I can't remember which passage it is, but he's talking about how, Jesus is like, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but like the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, nowhere to call his place home. And he's like, yeah, maybe that meant physically, like Jesus roaming around and being kind of houseless, but that was also Jesus's like MO. The Sadducees were mad at him, the Pharisees were mad at him, and he was always just like, I'm bringing the kingdom. I'm extending love. I'm extending mercy. And it put him in this middle place where he just kind of made everybody mad, which was, if we're going to share in the sufferings of Christ, I guess that's a good spot to be in. Yeah, really cool. Okay, so we kind of have this thing in the West where I think we've placed sexual gratification, the romantic story even, the idea that me being with someone that I was always meant to be with is the pinnacle of my happiness in life. And once I've found that soulmate, once I've had that fulfilling sexual chemistry, then I will have arrived. And we kind of, I know I experienced this, but I kind of felt like I was aimlessly wandering through an awkward half identity as a single person. Like I'm not fully worth it to people unless I'm with someone else. And maybe that was just my narrative, but I wrestled with that. And we put sexual gratification and marriage to our soulmate like way up here. And I think that you've chosen to be celibate for slightly different reasons, but being celibate, I mean, I imagine not just identifying as a gay Christian, but being in the Western world where sexual gratification and being in a couple is so highly elevated, idolatized? That's not a word. Made an
Idolized
idol.
is the word you're looking for.
Idolized. Thank you. Thank you. You guys got my back. Idolized. What have you learned simply about the celibate? Like, what has the celibate life taught you about your relationship with God and your journey through faith?
Yeah. Um, you know, I used to say that I thought it would be really great if at a wedding ceremony somebody could have 1 Corinthians 7 as like the reading at the ceremony, because people have this tendency at Christian wedding ceremonies, they'll read 1 Corinthians 13, you know, like love is patient, love is kind, and it's as if and it's beautiful, and I'm enough of like a sap to be like, I'm so deeply moved, and the groom's coming down the aisle and it's just beautiful, and no, the groom doesn't come down, I don't know. The point is I love a little romance. A Cinderella Story with Hilary Duff was my favorite movie in high school. So the sap, I'm okay with some sap.
You got a lot of amens from the congregation on that one. That was good.
So don't hear me saying that I don't love some wedding romance. But I sometimes worry that some of the messaging that we do, even in Christian context, maybe especially in Christian context, about love in marriage, is as if to suggest that the best and most beautiful form of love that we can experience on earth is marital love. And so we take a perfectly wonderful passage like 1 Corinthians 13, all these good things that love is, or we take it is not good for a man to be alone of Genesis, and we sort of turn them into marriage passages, as if to say, like, this is why marriage is so great, and this is why, lo, being single and alone doth suck. You know, like, again, this is another one of those passages that apparently is in there somewhere. Who knows where in the Bible? And so I used to joke that it would be...
I think it was first hesitation, that one.
Yeah. I used to just think that it would be so wonderful to go to a wedding ceremony and to have the pastor read from 1 Corinthians 7, which here are a few of my favorite parts. And I actually, fun fact, I quoted this to my brother like a month after his wedding. He and I were hanging out, and I was like, John, I have some devotional thoughts from you, from the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And then I started to quote where it says, a single man is concerned with the things of the Lord and how to please the Lord. So too, a single woman is concerned with, the affairs of the Lord. She's totally devoted to the Lord in both body and mind. But a married man is concerned with the things of the world and how to please his wife. A married woman is concerned with the things of the world and how to please her husband. Their interests are divided. So then, the one who marries, they do okay. But the one who does not marry does better. And I always feel like, put that in your pipe and smoke it, married people. So again, we need to backtrack and just re-clarify. I think marriage is beautiful and wonderful. I think it's a great vocation through which some followers of Jesus are called to pursue him better in the company of another person. But I think the picture that the Bible paints for us is actually one in which celibacy is this equally and uniquely beautiful vocation, through which we can follow Jesus, through which we can be a blessing to the world around us, and through which we can actually be ourselves to whatever degree. Being ourselves means being who we were fully created to be, in the image of God and as people who follow God. And I actually think that there's even a beautiful amount of romance to be had in that, if you will. I know some of you, especially maybe the straight men who are present, will get a little uncomfortable with me leaning heavily into the Jesus is my boyfriend imagery. But hey, I'm celibate, so I've got to take what I can get. There was this time. It was the first time that I was in Los Angeles. Also the first time I'd ever been in California. So I flew to LA, and I was going to speak at a church. So there were people who were going to meet me the following day. But like that first day in LA, I just got a rental car from the airport. I drove myself to my hotel, And then I walked to dinner, which I also learned LA is apparently not a walking city. Like I should not have walked to dinner, but I did. I walked to dinner and people stared at me like I had a third eyeball. And I got to the restaurant and I hadn't realized when I Googled it that it was one of those restaurants with like a maitre d', like it was like snazzy enough to have somebody being like, yes, and how many are in your party? And I was like, one. And he looked at me like he was like, table for one? And I was like, yeah, table for one. And I had to consciously reframe in my mind, like, what does it look like to think of this moment not as, here I am all alone in Los Angeles, terribly depressed, waiting for the moment when someone will finally come along and sweep me off my feet. Can I instead say, no, this is me on a date with the author of the universe, and literally any Tinder boyfriend that you could come up with me any Tinder boyfriend that you could invent for me would not hold a candle to the author of the universe sitting across this table from me. So I was like, I'm on a date with Jesus. So I'm sitting there at the table, I'm having my dinner, and I was like interacting with Jesus about LA, about this restaurant, about things going on in my life. We're like having a little conversation, not out loud because I thought that would creep out the other diners. And yet, apparently there was this look on my face like I was interacting with someone because my waiter kept stopping at the table and being like, I'm sorry, sir, did you need something? And I was like, oh, no, sorry, it's there's nothing. And he was like, oh, you just looked like you were interacting with someone. And I was like, yeah, you're not wrong. You're really not wrong. But there was this beautiful sense in which
he's just like freaking out.
Yeah. I mean, was it a little weird? Yes, absolutely. But again, we lean into that. I think if we lean into the notion that singleness as vocation does not have to be deprivation of the thing that is so beautiful, the good thing that the married people can have. But this is actually a way of saying, hey, let's really lean into the fact that this ultimate and final relationship that all of us will enjoy with Jesus is something that I get to anticipate right now. That I get to say, like, yes, Jesus is like my number one in this moment, not just eventually after my spouse and I die, then I'll be married to Jesus. But like, no, Jesus and I are in the engagement right now. I think there's something beautiful about really leaning into that.
Yeah, that's so good. You know, I think both you and Dr. Wesley Hill write about a concept like this in your book, where you know, the idea of the marriage is imagery that the Bible uses to describe the relationship between heaven and earth, between God and his people. And so the earthly marriage becomes this reflection of that greater glory. But we often swap out the glory for the reflection of the glory. We swap out for the thing that we are being pointed to as the thing itself. And in that, we don't find full fulfillment because what our soul is longing for is something that's greater, that's bigger, that is God himself. And so I appreciate that so much. I remember when I was, my wife is sitting in the front row, and we have a beautiful marriage, and we love each other very much. But I remember when I was young, I had a really hard time being single. And I just went from, like, in high school, just relationship to relationship to relationship. And like I said, I kind of felt incomplete. And upon reflecting on my life, you know, I wish I had treated that single season of celibacy as something that was more sacred and something that was a covenant between me and God, and embrace that rather than just waiting for it to be over. Because I think I missed out on some of the joys that God had for me in that season. Yeah, so thank you for sharing about that. I'm gonna throw another ad lib question in here. I imagine I've had friends who have been single for long periods of time. I don't have a ton of friends that have chosen celibacy, but you know, even those friends have told me, like, there are some seasons where, yeah, I feel lonely, where communities felt harder to come by. What has been the thing for you that's helped to fulfill that human relationship? It's not good for man to be alone in a relational sense. Like, what has fulfilled that for you in your life?
Yeah, I think a couple things that have been really helpful for me. One has been to expect a degree of difficulty and of not feeling like the moment something is hard or the moment I feel sorrow in my life, freaking out and being like, clearly I'm doing something wrong. But to instead say, no, like, it's okay if this is hard sometimes. Um, the fact that I am wrestling with a sense of sorrow in my life doesn't mean that I have missed the boat on God's call on my life. It may in fact be a sign that I'm precisely where I need to be. The fact that it feels like there's some taking up my cross daily and following Jesus does not mean that I have failed to follow Jesus. It's probably an indicator that I am actually following Jesus. If I can't find the cross anywhere, if I'm looking around like this just appears to be a cakewalk, then it may be that I have missed the boat on following Jesus.
That's good.
So I think that's one thing that's been helpful. But by no means is my only answer to your question, Lane, like, yeah, just accept that it's going to suck and deal with it. I think there's also, so one of my favorite passages in the Bible, it's so good that it's in all three of the synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew 19, and then again in Mark 10, and then again in Luke 18. And it's this moment where Peter has just said to Jesus, like, Jesus, we left everything to follow you. And so I just want to know what's going to be left for us. And Jesus says, truly, I tell you, there is no one who has left home or fathers or mothers or sisters or brothers or wives or children or fields for my sake and the gospel, who will not fail to receive 100 times in this life, wives, mothers, sisters, brothers, etc., along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. And I've always been struck by the fact, first of all, that Jesus doesn't deny that something is given up when we follow him. He doesn't say, like, Peter, you idiot, you didn't give up a thing, like, quit whining and go stand with Thaddeus. Like, Jesus admits, like, yeah, like, there is real difficulty. There really is something given up in following me. And yet the thing that he promises us in return is 100-fold the very things that we lost. And it's not just 100-fold in the next life, right? It's not just suffer through your miserable human existence, then you'll die, and then things will be better. But he's making this testable promise that in this life, you'll receive 100-fold the things that you lost. And I love that he specifically says the family that you've lost. Because I think for me, especially when I think about my life in the context of singleness, it feels like one of the things that I have lost in a very obvious way is some of the most natural seeming pathways, especially in the Western 21st century, some of the most natural pathways to have family and to have a sense of belonging. It feels like I have given those things up for Jesus. And yet, when I look at some of the relationships that I have in the body of Christ, like some of the people that God has put in my life, those people are like family to me, and not just in the abstract Christian-y, like we show up at church and sit in the pew next to each other and it feels like family, and then we go home and do absolutely nothing that's remotely like family, right? Like, I think sometimes Christians just throw around like the family of God, but they don't really mean it. Like, it doesn't actually cost anything. It's like, I'll do coffee with you every other Tuesday because we're the family of God. Like, family is messy. Family is intertwined. Like, family is like calling each other up at 1 a.m. and being like, look, I'm having a major crisis at the moment, which is a thing I've done. And what I have experienced in my own life is that as I say to God, I'm willing to let go of my control over trying to make a family for myself, but I'm going to need you to actually give me family in a really concrete and material and meaningful way. It turns out that God is actually remarkably good at keeping that promise. Not always in the ways that I expect. Sometimes I'm like, God, here's the sort of person that I want you to provide for me. Like, I want a best friend who's like, blah, 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 blah. Let me give you my list. And God is instead like, I'm actually going to give you like a 79-year-old woman who wants to talk with you about baking. And I was like, that was not what I had planned. And then we get together and I'm like, it's great. I didn't realize I needed a 79-year-old woman to talk with me about baking. Lo and behold. but I think the reality is that God does provide, God does keep his promises to us. And if we believe that that's true, then we might as well lean into it and live like it really is true. Because if it's not, like if God doesn't keep that promise, why should we expect he keeps any of his promises? And if he doesn't keep any of his promises, like what are any of us doing here this evening? Like I should just go to bed and y'all should break up your meeting now because there's really nothing good going to happen at this point. But if God is who he says he is, then that is one of the promises that he will keep for us.
Wow. I feel like I'm learning so much from you, Greg. That was beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so looking back on your life and kind of your journey of coming out and people learning about your situation, what were some moments where you felt really cared for and loved as you were wrestling with this? What were some moments where you felt really cared for, really loved by the church in these moments?
Yeah, I think so. One of the families that I am closest with at the church that I'm still at, and it's the same church that I was at as I was just beginning to come out publicly, is my pastor and his family. And when I first came out to them, there were a number of things that just really indicated to me like this was going to be a good place to be. This was going to be a safe place to be. And one was that they were remarkably good at creating space for me to process stuff related to my sexuality when I needed to process it, without always insisting that I process it with them. Right, like there are sort of two opposite errors that people can potentially enter into when you come out to them. The one is like as soon as they find out, they like get so awkward that they never want to talk about it again. And every time you get remotely close, they're like, "But tell me more about your bakery job." And then on the opposite side, there are the people who like every time you see them after that, they're like, "So, how's it going with and in a weird way, like both of those approaches are sort of equally alienating, because it's like if this really is the component of my experience, then I want to be able to talk about it with you in a way that's honest and real. And this, by the way, is precisely the motivation for coming out. Like some people will ask me like, why do you have to come out at all? Like that should just be a private matter. Like you shouldn't say that to anybody. And the answer is like, well, because it impacts my life in a number of ways. Like it is a big part of the reason I'm single. It has implications for how I look at the world around me. I processed the sort of political upheaval that occurred around the time of the Supreme Court of Obergefell decision very differently than I think I might have processed it if I were straight. So there are just ways in which, if I'm going to tell you authentically about my journey with Jesus and what it has looked like for me to wrestle through my faith, that's going to be part of the story. But it's also not the entire story. I don't want the whole story of my life with Jesus or my life writ large to be all about how I was gay. As I've become fond of saying, there is so much more to the Gregness than the gayness. So it can feel a little totalizing. It can feel a little limiting for people like every time they see me to want to be like, let's talk about the fact that you're gay. Like, actually, there were a whole ton of other things that we could have talked about. And in fact, here's a fun fact about being gay and celibate. It takes very little time. Like not having sex takes very little of my time. So I actually have a remarkable amount of time to invest in other things that are in many ways much more important to me.
But that makes sense.
So anyway, all that to say, yeah, one of the great gifts that this family gave to me was the gift of being able to process my sexuality with them as it was helpful, as I needed to grieve, as I needed to rejoice. They didn't freak out about having me around their kids or anything like that. They didn't assume that gay people were pedophiles. Fun fact, we are not. They welcomed me all the more into their lives. Their reaction to me coming out to them was basically, we're so glad to know that, because now we get to know you even better than we did before, and that's good news for us. And I just became so much more naturally a part of their lives. And I think that's really, if there's one thing, if there's a single thing that you do with somebody who's LGBTQ, who you want to love well, it's really just make them all the more a part of your lives and love them more as you know more of their story.
That's really good. There was something that you said in your book too that I thought was really cool. You said, you know, if you want to love gay people well, you have to respect them enough to trust them to make their own decisions. I think it was something along those lines. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I think there's a temptation for many of us, and I think this comes out around a lot of theological issues, but especially strongly in my experience around issues of sexuality and sexual ethics. There's a temptation to feel like the most important thing we can offer somebody else is to like answer the questions for them, to be like, look, I heard you were thinking about sexual ethics. Good news. I've solved the problem for you. Here's the answer. Just take it from me. Let's move on with our lives. Or, you know, to every time you see me, be like, hey, Greg, have you read Romans 1 recently? You know, like just checking in, just wanted to make sure. Here's the deal, folks. If your hope for somebody who's gay or same-sex attracted is that they will come to the historic biblical conclusion about sexual ethics, and so they will find themselves called either to opposite-sex marriage or to celibacy, either one of those options is going to be a costly thing for them. And it's not going to be something that they can walk a lifetime of obedience through on the basis of somebody else's faith. Like, no matter how much I respect Lane, I can't just be like, Lane, tell me the thing that I should do. And he'll be like, look, Greg, here's the very costly thing that you should do for the rest of your life. And I'll be like, great, I'm gonna just take your word for it and do that for the rest of my life. Like, if I'm going to walk a lifetime of costly discipleship, it's going to be because I, in relationship with Jesus, actually heard from Jesus, and he is actually making it possible for me to live like a person in love with him, even though it's countercultural, even though it's difficult, even though it is daily carrying a cross. And so the best thing we can do for somebody is not try to subvert that process and be like, you don't need to hear from Jesus when you could hear from me. The best thing we can do for people is, in fact, point them to Jesus and say, look, I'm happy to help you to the degree that you want my help. I'm happy to help you wrestle through what Jesus is saying. I'm happy to help you understand how I've reached the conclusions that I've reached. But ultimately, the best thing I can do for you is point you toward Jesus and say, you're going to have to get your answer from Jesus. And once you've heard from him, then I will walk with you as you seek to be obedient to him.
That's really good. Greg, speaking from like your personal experience, like again, you don't represent all gay people. From your personal experience, what do you think the church has done historically in your life and the lives of others like you that has been damaging and harmful to the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah. Well, I'll say first of all, on this count, I've lived a pretty charmed life. I personally. So, I mean, there are some things that people have done that have been less than ideal for me. You know, I don't love it when people used to say, they do it less now that I've come out, conveniently enough. But I used to be around a lot of people who would say things like, homosexuality, like it's so disgusting. People always find it really easy to be disgusted by the sins that don't particularly attract them. We're sort of we prefer people who sin like we do. Uh, so no, I mean, and also the conflation of the use of the category homosexuality tends to conflate a certain kind of sexual behavior with a sexual orientation. And so to say something like homosexuality is sinful can become really difficult for somebody in my position, because I could say, well, maybe I agree with you that certain forms of sexual behavior are not God's best for me. And yet at the same time, I still have a same-sex orientation. Are you telling me that I am inherently in sin just by virtue of existing? And I feel like often that distinction has not been clearly made. And so what we as the church have often communicated to LGBTQ people, whether it was intentional or unintentional, is you, by virtue of your existence, are already an abomination to God. God already hates you. There's nothing you can do about it. So good luck with that. That has fed into things like the ex-gay movement, conversion therapy. You've probably heard expressions like "pray the gay away." This mercifully was something that I avoided in my own life. I never went to ex-gay camp, and I'm very grateful for it, because I know a lot of people who did, and their view of God was really harmed as a result of it, because the thing that they were told was, you need to be like this if God is actually at work in your life, if he actually loves you, if you actually love him. And then they were presented with a goalpost that was impossible for them to reach, or that they did not reach, that God in fact did not ordain for them to become straight. And so then they were forced to wrestle with, well, do I choose to believe in God and think that he hates me, or do I just give up on this God thing altogether, or do I decide that somebody's lying to me? So there's a lot of human wreckage left in the wake of the ex-gay movement. I had a friend recently. He had gone to the theater to watch the movie Boy Erased, which maybe some of you have seen it, but it's a movie based on a book that's about somebody's experience of ex-gay therapy, and both the movie and the book are sort of like devastating and just wrecking. And he told me he went to the theater, he watched it, and when he came home, he lay down on the floor of his apartment and he said, I just said curse words over and over for like an hour, because there was just so much anguish and so much wrong belief about God being woven in with things that are true about God, that it becomes really hard to disentangle the truth and the falsehood. So yeah. that I think is one of the church's great sins. I'll also note, just by way of a little addition, that the church's role in the AIDS crisis, beginning in the 80s, was largely one of rejoicing as they watched gay people die. The church was actually instrumental in encouraging the U.S. government to be slow in responding to the crisis. They were pleased to see that it seemed to mostly be the gay people who were dying. They declared that it was the Lord's judgment, and there are harrowing recordings that you can find of people discussing this new phenomenon and laughing about it and thinking that it was great news for the world that the gay people were dying. So those kinds of hurts continue to be remembered by LGBTQ people today. And so a lot of their distrust in Christian community it has historical merit. There's a reason for it. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge those hurts, to acknowledge the sins of our Christian community against LGBTQ people, to lament those things, to confess those things, and then to seek to right those wrongs in the ways that we reach out and love people now.
Yeah, wow, that's heavy. I feel like something that has frustrated me growing up in the church is sometimes seeing a lack of ability for the church to corporately repent of something or corporately lament the tragedy of something. It's always, the pandemic hit because it's God's punishment on liberal America, or, the fires are starting because this is God's punishment on, like they try to ration out human suffering as like God's doing. And instead of loving the people that these things are affecting, and then when they swing this way, they don't repent for the damage that they've done. And I've always found that really harmful. I mean, I know that for me personally, I always grow in respect towards leaders that tell me, I was wrong and I'm sorry. That person doesn't lose respect in my eyes. I wish our politicians said stuff like that more often. I was wrong and I'm sorry. So if I could just take a moment, Greg, to you and to other people in the room, I'm sorry that the church has behaved the way that it has historically. We ask for your forgiveness, and we lament that there has been a lot of harm. A lot of people that have felt boxed out, a lot of people that have felt abused and oppressed. It's not okay, and we're sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but hopefully we can start there and grow towards something in reconciliation. Thank you for sharing that, Greg. That was insightful. In your opinion, what do you feel like the church can do to extend the heart of God towards the LGBTQ plus community? What can we practically do in order to extend the heart of God?
Yeah. First of all, I would say there are some real concrete needs in the LGBTQ community that Christians, regardless of where you stand on questions related to sexual ethics, Christians can all get on board with these things. So things like trying to combat LGBTQ bullying in schools. Things like being concerned about the high rate of homelessness among LGBTQ youth. The latest statistics I know of are that about 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And this is compared to maybe 10 or 15% of youth overall identifying as LGBTQ. So a disproportionate amount of homelessness is happening among LGBTQ kids. Rates of suicidality tend to be higher among this population, which is partially tied to bullying and is also partially tied to high rates of family rejection. So there are concrete needs, to help combat bullying, to help get kids off the streets. And there are things that churches can and should be in favor of, but they're often overlooked because they're dismissed as being part of the gay agenda. Which, whenever people talk to me about the gay agenda, I'm like, number one, it makes it sound like we get together and have these meetings, and I've never been invited to one of these meetings. But to the degree that gay people broadly have an agenda, I'm pretty sure our agenda is things like, hey, we want to see folks who are thinking about suicide. We want to see them cared for well. Hey, we want to see schools actually take a stand against bullying. Hey, we want to see homeless kids taken care of. We want to see people who are kicked out of their homes taken care of. And these are things that the church can partner with. I think when it comes to reaching out to individual LGBTQ people and to the more local communities, I think a big part of our interaction needs to be about repentance, as we've talked about. And again, I think one gift that we can give people is the gift of prioritizing just inviting them into relationship with Jesus. Recognizing that it's not our job to change how anyone is deciding to live in obedience or disobedience to Jesus. It's not our job to persuade people to hold a certain view about sexual ethics. Our job is really to point people to Jesus and say, hey, there's this Jesus guy, and you may have been told the lie that he's not interested in you because you're gay. But the reality is he's actually madly in love with you. And the fact that you feel like you're stuck on the margins is all the more reason that Jesus is eagerly reaching out to you, eagerly seeking for you. There are so many people I know of who feel like if they could find a Christian community that would just welcome them in, even if they didn't agree with that community about everything, just say like, we want you here. We don't want you to feel like you need to be hidden here. We're not going to try to browbeat you to do your life in a certain way, but we want you to be here. We want you to be part of us so that you can genuinely encounter Jesus. I think to open up our lives and our homes and our Christian spaces for that kind of engagement could be such a beautiful and powerful thing.
Yeah, you could say that 3 times tonight, and I think that'd be a great message for us to ingrain in our hearts. You know, I think Jesus is always in the business of transforming us into his likeness, but I think we'd be more comfortable if he transformed other people into our likeness. We often take it upon ourselves to change people, and like that's the Holy Spirit's job, you know. And I think we would have a lot of peace in our hearts and minds if we didn't take that on as like it's our duty to make sure that this happens in their heart. You know, Jesus is the same in their life as he is in mine, and he has a lot of changing to do in me, that's for sure. Speaking of which, I guess this will be my last like question before I open it up for Q&A. So guys, if you haven't submitted your questions and you do have one, feel free to go ahead and do that. It was the number that you texted upon doing the contact tracing. I feel like there was a line in your book where you beautifully articulated the value of suffering that Jesus' followers are called to. You said, "My life has never been more beautiful than it was when it was the most brokenhearted." What can followers of Jesus, all followers of Jesus, learn from the journey of a gay Christian? What do you feel like the community of Christ as a whole has to learn from the specific, unique journey of a gay Christian?
I think so. There was a moment in my own wrestling through my theology and where I was going to land on this question of sexual ethics. There was a moment when I was confronted with what felt at the time like the unfairness of my situation. And I remember feeling like, you know, why should God be allowed to say to me that this is what I need to give up for him? And I remember wrestling with that question and feeling startled at first, as if I had been saying to Jesus, like, I'll follow you, you know, I'll follow you wherever you lead. And I could look at him and sort of see like the thorns digging into his forehead. And then moments later, I would turn around and look at my own life and be like, how dare you? The moment that I started to discover that there was a thorn of my own, you know, and I think part of the problem is that especially in the 21st century West, I think we've grown accustomed to thinking of ease and safety as being sort of the baseline experiences of humanity, the thing that we all deserve, the thing that we should be able to expect from our lives. And then anything that runs contrary to that, anything that feels like suffering, then shocks us. But I think the reality is if we take Jesus seriously, then hardship and difficulty should not be the shocking thing. Those things are supposed to be part of what we expect as followers of Jesus. And so I think maybe the problem is not that being celibate costs me too much as a gay person. But maybe the problem is just that I've grown accustomed to living in a world where I look around me and it seems like I don't see people giving up much to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And maybe the problem is that I also am not giving up enough to, like, if I'm just like, look, Jesus, I'm not having sex, like that better be enough for you. Like, I think that's still a pretty low bar, you know? I wonder if the problem is just that we've gotten so accustomed to thinking that our lives ought to be a certain kind of thing. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm calling you to something else entirely. and what we need to do is reset our expectations and say, actually, we should expect that following Jesus is going to be really, really costly. And then we should expect also not just that it's going to be costly in like a depressing way, but we should expect that in that costliness, there's actually going to be a joy that Jesus has for us that's so much better than the kind of joy that we get just by living an easy and cost-free life.
Say it again. That's good. That's really good. All right, I'm gonna get into some of these questions. One person texted in, it seems as though many people in the church are afraid of gay people because it is the unknown to them. How do we combat that fear personally and at large in the community?
Yeah. Personally, well, if I were there with you in person, I would say, like, you need to find a gay person to practice with, so come practice on me. Like, you just have a conversation, get used to it. And I would still say, like, make some friends, like, get used to being in relationship with people who are different from you in that way. I also think, familiarize yourself with some stories of people whose experience of sexuality is unlike yours. I think that's in the same way that it's helpful for us to be aware of the stories of people who are different from us in other ways, right? Like, I would encourage you to read stories of people who have a different experience of racial identity than yours. Or if you're an able-bodied person, maybe read some stories from people doing life with certain kinds of disabilities. In encountering the world through somebody else's eyes, you'll actually get such a deepened perspective of the world around you. And you'll start to see things that felt perfectly normal and fine when you just looked at it through your own perspective. And you'll begin to see some of their flaws, or some of the ways in which these systems that we've built up don't serve everybody equally, when you're willing to start looking at them through somebody else's eyes. So I think that's really valuable. Find stories, find people, and try to build that relational connection. I think as a community, I think it's really helpful if we can start to normalize conversations about sexuality, conversations like this one. And for instance, to not always need to talk about non-normative sexualities in like a separate, to not always be like, we've set aside one moment during which we will talk about LGBTQ people, and then the rest of the time we'll just assume that everyone is straight. But to instead start to get used to saying, like, okay, like, we're actually talking to all the people all the time. We don't need a separate chapter, we don't need you sequestered off in a different part of the room. But we're actually expecting that the same gospel is true for all of us. We're expecting that we all need the same good news here. And so we expect everybody to be in the room with us all the time.
That's so freaking good. Oh my gosh. I love that. Love that. This one seems like a very personal story. My father was bisexual. Because of his promiscuity, he contracted HIV and passed it on to my mother after I was born. I watched her die from AIDS-related pneumonia at 4 years old. I had this hatred toward him even though he was never there as a father, and he passed when I was 8. How can I change my point of view towards God as a father based on how my father was? Wow, there's a lot in that.
Wow. Well, first of all, let me say, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think one of the hardest things that we wrestle with as people whose best picture of God is the human beings around us, because God does say when he creates people, he's like, I'm going to make some people in my image. I'm going to make people who resemble me in some fashion. And so when they look around, they will see each other and they will see some sense of me in each other. There's something that can be and is so beautiful about the fact that we can look at other human beings and see God reflected through them to us. But that also means that when people mess up, when the world is distorted, as the world is fundamentally distorted by the fall, then our view of God gets distorted too along the way. And so I think to the degree that we can try to take a step back, and I guess I would encourage you to ask Jesus two things. First of all, maybe ask him, Jesus, can you give me a vision for the good and beautiful original intention that you had, even for these people who have let me down? Like, can you help me see the way in which you intended goodness for them, the way in which you still gifted them as your beautiful creation, even though they made some terrible choices along the way, even though they suffered from the effects of sin in various ways. Can you help me see the original beauty that you had in mind for them? And then the second thing would be just to pray, Jesus, can you show me in the midst of my own pain, and in the midst of everything going wrong, can you reveal to me where you were? Just ask God, where were you? And if the question, where were you, comes with some pain or with some anger, that's okay. Jesus is more than big enough to deal with your pain and your anger. And I think it's far better for us to pray sincere prayers for him than to try to edit our prayers and never really tell him the truth. But just ask him, where were you? Because I know in my own life that some of those dark moments that I look back to and I say, where were you, Jesus? There'll be a time that I feel like I can't see him at all. And then as I slowly listen, I start to see where he was. And sometimes he has answers for me that are not at all what I expected. But just recognizing his presence there with me, even if it's just that he's there alongside me and weeping with me as things go wrong, just to recognize that Jesus is present, that he is Emmanuel, God with us. He's not just somebody who watches from a distance, who spectates our lives, but he's actually someone who participates, who is in it with us and for us. So just asking that question, Jesus, where were you? And then opening up space for Jesus to speak that truth into your heart. That would be my encouragement to you.
Yeah, I feel like if Jesus could be on the cross and say, my God, why have you forsaken me? That gives us permission to lament and to ask him genuine questions about, like, where is your promises in this? And I think he's God enough to handle it, for sure. Next question is, how does the church love gay couples who are married and love Jesus?
An excellent question. So
just all the easy stuff tonight. We're just
yeah, appreciate that. So there are a couple distinctions that I would want to make here. I think, and regardless of these distinctions, I think the church can and should love all of these different couples. But I think the answer of how the church might love a particular couple will be very different depending on whether they fall into one of three categories. Are they a married gay couple who do not identify as followers of Jesus? Do they identify as followers of Jesus, but they have a more progressive sexual ethic and they believe that Jesus is calling them to be married to each other? Or are they following Jesus and they have maybe even just recently come to the conviction that perhaps Jesus is calling them to no longer be, at least in sexual relationship with each other? All three of those kinds of couples exist. And all three of those kinds of couples need the love of Christian community when we have the opportunity to love them. But what our love looks like for those three different kinds of couples may be very, very different. um, when let me start at the ends and work my way into the middle. If we're talking about a couple who does not think of themselves as followers of Jesus, then I think we love them in the way that we love everybody who doesn't follow Jesus, which is to say, we care about their lives, we care about the people that they love, and to the degree that they're open to talking about Jesus, we just want to nudge them into relationship with Jesus. We're certainly not concerned about behavior modification. We're not trying to tell them what they should or shouldn't be doing. Lord knows when I talk to my non-Christian friends, it would be silly for me to tell them all the things I think they shouldn't be doing, because the reality is if I weren't following Jesus, I would probably be right there with them. Or in some cases, like well past them. So that I think is, we love them. We open our homes and our lives just as we would for anybody else. If we're talking about somebody who, a couple in which one or both of them is following Jesus and has come to the conviction that they should no longer be in a sexual relationship, I think that raises some really important questions for how we can materially come alongside people. I've known, for instance, there will be couples who will say, hey, we're wrestling with the question of whether it's okay for us to still stay legally married, even though, you know, we could like get different rooms in the house. We want to stop thinking of ourselves as married to each other as far as the sexual component of our relationship is concerned. But like one of us gets health insurance from the other. And we only have one house, or we've adopted a child and we don't want to just leave our child. You know, there are some real complicating factors. And I think it's important, number one, for churches to be willing to get creative, to enter into the messiness, and to not just sort of waltz in with our easy answers like, well, obviously, here's what you should do. It's probably not nearly as obvious as you think it is. And also, if people do conclude that Jesus is calling them to costly things like, say, ending their civil marriage and so losing their healthcare benefits, is the church willing to step around a couple like that and say, we're actually going to help you carry that financial burden that you can't carry otherwise? Are we actually that committed to helping people do what they feel like they need to do in order to follow Jesus? I think those are real questions, and I think we can't presume their answers. But I think we need to be willing to enter into that mess with people and to walk with them as they figure out what it looks like to be faithful to Jesus. When it comes to the final couple, the couple who identify as Christians, but their perspective of sexual ethics is such that they would say, no, we actually believe that Jesus is enthused that we are in a loving monogamous relationship with each other. That's where I think we need to wrestle with what it looks like to love people in cases where there's sincere doctrinal disagreement between us. I don't think that sexual ethics is one of those doctrines we should just shrug our shoulders at and be like, yeah, 6 of one, half dozen the other. You know, I don't think we just all join arms and sing Kumbaya. But at the same time, I don't know that it's helpful for us to fling theological feces at each other either. I think there needs to be such a thing as convicted difference, where we respect the reasons that people think differently than we do. We continue to want to nudge them in the direction of Jesus, which is the same thing I do with everybody else. Like, I hope I'm always nudging everyone I know more in the direction of Jesus. And I hope they're nudging me, because Lord knows I don't have it all figured out. So I think we need to be able to create space for people like that, to love them, to be invested in their lives, to care about them, while yet recognizing, hey, there is difference here, and it is substantial. It's not something that we just ignore or think, you know, everything is fine. We don't just throw truth to the wind, and yet we enter into relationship in a way that's still open-armed, and in a way that ultimately entrusts people to Jesus, rather than us trying to make ourselves the arbiter of somebody else's life.
Yeah, that's really good. If I can add to that, I think you'll be hard pressed to find any room of Christians where every single one, or even one of them, believes all of the right things and has all the right practices surrounding God. I just don't think that person exists. And like Greg said, I don't think that we shrug off really important issues. Something that I've tend to have been thinking about recently is like pacifism. There are whole movements of Christianity who believe it is murder to kill for any reason whatsoever. And there are other Christians who believe there are just reasons to go to war with another nation or to kill in self-defense. And those two Christians fundamentally disagree about one of the 10 commandments. They fundamentally disagree about what it means to allow someone to have human life, which is the most basic form of human dignity. Yet, we don't see these kinds of, there are heated debates, but we don't see the church dividing denominations and creating these uproars and giving disgust towards those who have different views in pacifism, or complementarian versus egalitarianism, for example. We are a part of an egalitarian tradition where we believe that women are empowered to be leaders, women are empowered to be equal sharers of authority and responsibility in the household. But there are tons of other Christians who do not think that, who believe that the differences between men and women are that women are to submit to their male, and I'm probably not representing complementarians in the most holistic and unbiased way. I apologize, but we disagree on that, and I might even look at a complementarian and say, I believe your beliefs surrounding women are sinful and oppressive and wrong, but I'm not going to take their views on war, on alcohol, on a number of other huge issues and say, therefore, you are not a true brother or sister in Christ. I just feel like I don't have that kind of authority as Lane to do that. And again, that doesn't mean I don't have convictions. Like, there are people where I look at their theological positions and I say, you know what, I think you are absolutely wrong about how you've interpreted the Bible, about how you apply it to your life, and about how you vote because of it. But I believe that Christ's grace is far more powerful than I can comprehend or understand. And I have to be comfortable with the idea that I actually can't control what people believe, even if I disagree with them. And so I have to trust that Jesus is somehow bringing us in unity, even if we disagree with one another. So I appreciate that. And again, like, you came to a place academically where you were like, I can't reconcile the ability to partake in gay sex and follow Jesus. And so you made that decision for yourself. Which I think speaks a lot to people trusting you in your life to make your decision and to see Christ in you. So, anything to add to that? Any damage you want to correct?
That was good. I'll give a hearty amen to that, and I'll just add two short things. Number one, bless your egalitarian denomination. Warms my heart. I am an egalitarian in a complementarian denomination at the moment, and I do find myself occasionally wrestling with. So I work part-time for my church right now as a worship leader, and I find myself in this sort of wrestling of, like, it can be challenging at times to be like, how much do I sort of feel like I can totally lean in and invest in the vision of this church when I'm like, ooh, that is a fundamental disagreement that I think is really important. And yet, as you're saying, Late, I mean, as my father would say, that'll preach. It's so true that, like, I look at the people around me and I just feel like, well, like, the Holy Spirit is clearly at work here. And it's not exactly how I would do it. And I probably, I probably won't be in exactly this spot doing exactly this thing forever. And yet I can still look at people who think differently than me on important things and affirm Jesus is still doing something in you. And I can still get excited about that.
Yeah, that's so good. And I'll say too, I wasn't just throwing that out as a philosophical conversation. Like, I have dear friends of mine who we fundamentally disagree about things like pacifism and sexuality. And we enter into conversation, and guess what? It is, like, freaking hard because we care desperately about the things that we're talking about. And where I might hold a traditional sexual ethic and my friend does not, I still have to trust that Jesus is at work in her, even though I believe that she's doing things that are damaging for her. There are things that I'm doing that Jesus is going to reveal to me later that were damaging for me, that I thought was correct. And so anyway, I appreciate that. And I understand that what I just said may be really uncomfortable for some of you. And I want you to know, like, come and talk to me. I'm open to changing my mind. I've ended up changing my mind about stuff in the Bible a lot because Jesus is continuing to grow and form me and bring me into a fuller understanding of his grace. And so please come and talk to me if you have a grievance or disagreement or a question. I would love to be able to talk to you. Greg, I'm gonna ask two more questions, and then we're gonna call it because it's getting late for you over there. It's almost midnight your time in Pennsylvania.
It's true. It is.
Yeah.
Bring on the party.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. We're so thankful that you're here. So he started this conversation at 10:30, which for some of you are like, dude, I'm out. This next question is, I have gay coworkers who are good friends of mine. However, my ultra-conservative family still views LGBTQ plus people in an unloving way. So I don't even bring up my friendships because I know how they will respond. How can I change their deeply ingrained mindset to how Jesus actually sees it?
Yeah. I think a couple things that can be helpful. One is, well, number one, let me just affirm, like, I love that you're asking that question. And I love that you have a heart to be part of seeing that change in your family. I would say, to the degree that you can willingly wade into some uncomfortable conversations, bring things up, even if you know that it'll unsettle the peace a little bit. Maybe be willing to not just go with the flow, but to actually raise issues that help challenge where your family is right now. It's the sort of thing, for instance, that I have been trying to do increasingly in my own life as a white person in conversations about race in the United States, to recognize, hey, I'm in some circles where some unhelpful things are happening vis-a-vis race. And it may feel easy for me as a white person to just sort of be like, whatever, I'll let it slide. There are no people of color here right now, so it's not a big deal. But I actually have an opportunity in those moments to start to respond, to maybe challenge people's thinking a little bit, to plant some early seeds, to say, hey, I read this great article, let me recommend it to you. I have the opportunity to plant some seeds so that, God willing, down the road, when there is a person of color present in our conversation, I will have done maybe some of the preliminary legwork so that the person of color doesn't have to do all the labor in this relationship. I think there can be a similar dynamic at play when we talk about issues related to sexuality. Like, if you, as somebody who has less of a personal stake in the matter, if you can put your own comfort on the line a little bit, and maybe nudge people in some ways that might feel uncomfortable for you, maybe introduce them to some stories that might challenge them to think differently. The work that you do up front could down the road pay some wonderful dividends in the kind of relationship that you'll enable down the line. I will say it'll definitely be uncomfortable at some point, and you also may not see immediate return for your labor. But I have seen over time, I've seen people's views remarkably change, especially as they start to encounter like the real stories and lives of LGBTQ people. So even if you just start to talk about your friends and invite your family into those stories, to think of your friends as real human beings, really created in the image of God, that could do some beautiful work.
Yeah, that's so good. All right, last question, Greg, and we're going to let you go and go to sleep, man. Last question is, could you elaborate more on homosexuality as a part of one's identity and its ability to be changed? If someone asks God wholeheartedly to remove that desire from them, doesn't he have the power to? Why do you think he sometimes wouldn't?
Ooh, okay, good. We've got like We've got like
all the
three
easy questions for you, man. We're just
Yeah,
taking it
this is
easy.
so great. Well, and I almost thought we were going to go through the evening without talking about like terminology or identity at all, but that turned out, studies showed that was a lie. Uh, so yes, so many good questions here. To disentangle them a little bit, first of all, let's talk about the possibility of change. So do I think that God has the power to change somebody's sexual orientation? Absolutely. Because as we see in scripture, God has the power to do all sorts of things, some of which are measurably preferable, like God has the power to heal people who are sick, some of which are just like changes in substance, right? Like God can change water into wine, like nothing against the water. God was just like, let's have some wine instead. Right? Like God can have Jonah swallowed by a whale or a big fish or whatever your translation says, like it's not that God always needs people swallowed by fish. He just felt like it in that moment. So God clearly gets to do lots of things that God wants to do. If God wants, he can transform the entire cast of Hamilton into a bunch of giant ferrets. So yeah, again,
Sounds pretty
God's,
cool.
yeah,
Friday
right.
night.
So God's got power for all the things. When it comes to a change in sexual orientation, I think before we ask how often it happens or how often it should happen, maybe it's helpful to ask whether or not it's inherently better for somebody to be straight. Now, I told you the story earlier about my first recognition of being gay was actually that I was not attracted to women. And here's a little story for you. In the season of life where I was like, let's try to be straight because that's what I've been told I should be if I love Jesus, there was actually this moment where I found like a picture of a scantily clad woman somewhere. And I was like, I've heard that if I were really like a proper straight boy, like I'm supposed to be if I love Jesus, I would like want to lust after this picture. So I was like, I'm going for it. So I took the picture and I was like, I'm like trying to feel the things, and for all the good it did, I might as well have been staring at like an office supplies poster. But
That's so funny.
it revealed to me in retrospect how distorted my logic was, that I actually thought that God would prefer for me to want to lust after women, which is a desire that I have literally never had in my life. So if work with me here, if my experience as somebody who's exclusively same-sex oriented is that there's a group of people that when I am tempted to lust, I am tempted to lust after that group of people. And for the record, I'm not always tempted to lust. Being gay doesn't mean that at every given moment I'm like, the men, I just can't handle myself, right? Like I'm currently staring at the very handsome face of Lane, but like that doesn't mean that I'm like currently lusting after Lane. No offense, Lane, very handsome, as I said. So there's a difference between like having the I would go on. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. There's a difference between like having the capacity to experience a certain kind of sexual temptation and actively experiencing sexual temptation. So when I say I'm gay or I'm same-sex oriented or same-sex attracted, I'm not saying that I am actively experiencing temptation at every moment. I'm just saying I've noticed a pattern in my life that if I am going to experience sexual temptation, it tends to be in this way and not in that way. So if we've got broadly two groups of people, and again, I'm oversimplifying here, but just for the sake of the argument, if we've got broadly the group of people who their attractions tend to be toward the same sex and not toward the opposite sex, and broadly their attractions tend to be toward the opposite sex and not the same sex, in both of those groups of people, you've got people who are going to need to say no to sexual temptation while simultaneously trying to figure out what the thing is that God is calling them to say yes to. Whether that is a yes that they say in marriage or whether that is a yes that they say in celibacy. And again, if we take the Bible seriously, there ought to be some people saying yes in both of those ways in our Christian circles. We're not all called to ultimately end up married. So if your
Ooh.
answer is like, well, obviously heterosexuality is better because that's how you get married, then the only reason you think heterosexuality is better is because you think marriage is better. So maybe you and the Apostle Paul and Jesus ought to get that sorted out first, and then we can talk about orientation. But here then would be my premise for you, that in fact, it's not as if being gay is like a more broken version of being straight. The reality, I think, is that any sexual orientation as we experience it after the fall of humankind is fundamentally post-lapsarian in nature. That is a fancy theological word for like, it happens after the fall, it can't happen before the fall. It is fundamentally fallen in its nature. Why? Because God's original intention is certainly not that I would lust willy-nilly after all the men, but it's also certainly not that I would lust willy-nilly after all the women. Anytime I'm experiencing a sexual attraction to somebody who is not my spouse, I am experiencing a sexual attraction that is post-lapsarian. So all of us have a broken sexual orientation, which means for me to become straight would not be a form of healing. It would just be an exchange of one form of brokenness for another. Having sort of laid that theoretical groundwork, then let me posit for you that maybe the reason that when people have historically prayed and sought to become straight, God has not tended to choose to do that for them. And I grant you, there are some exceptions to this. And again, I think the Lord is welcome to do as he pleases. And I think in God's sovereignty, there have been some people in whose lives God has said, I think this jarring change in their sexuality will be a thing that draws them toward me. If that's what happens, cool. I affirm it. I'm delighted by it. But I also think there are a number of us, myself included, for whom the Lord has not ordained to do that. And I don't think that makes my story with Jesus any less glorious. I think it means that God has ordained that within this fallen sexuality, rather than that fallen sexuality, he will choose to reveal himself to me. And then if we accept these premises, that being gay is not inherently worse or better than being straight, they're just two different ways of being post-lapsarian, and then we accept that maybe God allows some of us to stay that way. Why? Because God is doing his God thing. Then we come to this question of identity. What do I call myself? How do I frame myself in the world as somebody trying to acknowledge I seem to be persistently attracted to the same sex? And here there's a great debate among people about whether or not it's okay to use the word gay, whether it's better to call yourself something like same-sex attracted. Let me just say this. Both of those terms come with some baggage. Obviously, gay has plenty of cultural baggage with it. It's got a history that comes with it. Same-sex attracted may seem like the safer alternative, but same-sex attracted also comes with baggage, in large part because that term was born out of the ex-gay movement, which, as I discussed earlier, did some very harmful things for a number of people. So baggage on the one hand, baggage on the other. How do you choose which baggage shall your language carry? And those of us who are seeking to follow Jesus with conviction answer that question differently. My dear friend Rachel Gilson and I have become slightly notorious for like having this debate with each other in various forums. So if you really want to get deep into this, you can Google, if you Google Greg Cole's Rachel Gilson terminology dialogue, you will find like a 7-blog back and forth between the two of us talking about the reasons that I prefer the term gay, the reason she prefers the term same-sex attracted. There's a whole party to be had there. But I think the fundamental important thing as we ask these questions about language and identity is this. We're seeking language that helps us speak honestly to the world around us, that helps us communicate as well as we can to as many people as possible who Jesus is to us and who Jesus could also be to them. for me, that's a big part of why I've chosen the word gay, is because recognizing that there's a narrative that says it's impossible for you to be oriented to the same sex and also follow Jesus. I want to say, au contraire, I happen to be both gay and following Jesus, and you could do the same. I think there's power in using the language that community uses in order to communicate to them at kind of a heart level. But it's also important for us to recognize that our hearts are also prone to wander. Lord, I feel it, as the hymn writer says, and Lord, do I feel it. And so it's important for us to be careful in how we posture ourselves in relation to our experience of sexuality, which includes our experience of sexual temptation, to not get too cozy with aspects of our experience that we're ultimately believing, hey, like, I am not going to be tempted to lust after men in the new creation, you know? So we want to wrestle with how we talk about our current reality in the world, and yet recognize here's what it means to be people who are redeemed, who follow Jesus. And again, there's dialogue to be had about that, but I will refer you to a longer form of it because it is 11:59 p.m. my time, and I turn into a pumpkin in 1 minute.
So good. Wait, a pumpkin? Oh, Cinderella reference. Got it. I wasn't tracking for a moment. Greg, man, I don't even know how to thank you. I'm so grateful for your willingness to step into our space, although virtually, to step into our space and to be a part of this. What I think is a really difficult conversation. Can we admit that? It's a difficult conversation, and to help us navigate that. Worship team, can I have you come up for a moment? Greg, I'm going to ask you to pray for us, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I didn't tell you were going to do that, but you're a worship pastor, so you know what's up.
I would be delighted to pray for you guys. Jesus, I thank you that you are a God who meets each one of us right where we are. I thank you that you're not a God who waits until we have changed, until we have tidied ourselves up to come to you, but you're a God who enters into our stories and who redeems the stories that each one of us has. So tonight, God, I ask that you would empower and embolden this group. I ask that you would fill them up with your spirit, that you would equip them to go out and love the world around them. God, would you equip them especially to love the LGBTQ people around them, people in their communities, God, even people right here in this faith community. And Jesus, would you meet them in their own stories too? God, whether the folks who are gathered here tonight identify themselves as LGBTQ, or whether they are 100% card-carrying straight, God, they have stories and they have places in their lives where you want to meet them. There are things that you want to call them to. God, maybe you want to call them to a kind of costly obedience that they haven't even dared to think of until tonight. Jesus, would you open hearts, would you open minds, and would you speak loudly? Would you speak your call? Would you speak your love to the folks who are here? Jesus, we thank you for the work that you do, and we declare that we trust you. We declare that the places that you call us are good, even if they feel terrifying, even if they feel unsafe. We trust that the places you call us to are good. So we love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Can we say thank you to Greg? Greg, thank you so much, man. We'll have to fly you out in style next time so you can come hang out with us in PDX. It'll be fun.
Hey, I look forward to that.
All right. You have a good night. Get some sleep.
You too. Good night, guys.
All right. Bye.